Hey, so welcome back. Today we're going to talk about Azure AD, where we're going to talk about what Azure AD is and the basic structure of how you would see Azure AD in your Azure portal. So let's get started. So basically, this is an architecture diagram that I've borrowed from Microsoft's documentation. And to just give you a basic sense of what Azure AD is, think of it like any other database that holds your users' information and other related authentication and authorization information. For example, if you're creating an e-commerce website, you would require a specific database for holding its users, passwords, metadata, properties, and permissions and stuff like that. Now, Azure AD makes it all easier by handling all of it that I've just mentioned and provides authentication for all your applications, whether it is custom application or it is some application which is hosted on the internet and provided by the vendor, which is a typical SaaS application. Now, how Azure AD does it is to a series of standard industry standards like OpenID and OAuth 2, and we will be talking about in detail about various credential flows which we use in Azure AD and how you can attack and defend those as well. Now, if you see this diagram on the left side, you see external identities and internal identities. Now, the internal identities are something which you've created inside your organization. These are typically your employees or your vendors who are working in your company on a project for a very long time. Now, all of this is stored in Azure AD, and there is an opportunity of adding an external identities, which is done using federated login and federated authentication mechanisms. We also have multiple other ways in which we can, kind of leverage other authentication mechanisms as well. Now, quickly going into Azure AD in Azure portal, this is how you typically see Azure AD. And once you go into Azure AD, you have on the left side you have a whole bunch of different controls or basically various categories where you can sneak peek into each and every element of Azure AD. For example, the first important details that you'd see is the tenant ID and the primary domain. So think of primary domain as if you've used your AD, it is your primary domain name. Like, you've used something.com or something.local, but the only difference is the primary domain is something.onmicrosoft.com. Now, if you would want to add your custom domain to it, for example, if you're Walmart, and if you want to add all your users to your username at walmart.com, you could also do that using the custom domain names option, which is on the left side. Now, but for a normal user for testing purpose, for a research from a researcher perspective, you don't have to do that. But we'll also be covering the custom domain name at some point, further in the playlist. Now, typically you would see the list of users over here, and you would see each user can either be a part of whatever domain name you assign. For example, Pikachu.com is one domain name which I've added, and there is also the default domain name which got created when I created my Azure AD account. Now, if you go to an individual user, you would see multiple options, which basically I would categorize into two. One is information and management. The information of the specific user, what is the overview, when was this created, and how many groups is this particular user a part of, how many applications are this user is allowed to access, and how many licenses have been assigned, and how many roles were assigned to this particular user. And after that, we have a bunch of very interesting things with respect to security, which is audit log and sign-in logs, which again we'll be covering in detail in the logging section. But for now, all you need to know is this is for each individual users. If you want to triage that particular user's activity, you can go into that individual user in Azure portal and you can access these logs. However, you also have a consolidated logging section in the uh, here, which is sign-in logs, which is something I would say is better than accessing individual users if you are looking at threat hunting or those type of exercises instead of targeting a specific user. Now, going into an individual users, we've talked about information, which is basic information about a user. The second section which is there is management. So in this you can create or basically assign new permissions and licenses to the users, and you can assign Azure roles as well. Now, interesting enough, this is a very, very interesting topic, where you actually would now realize that Azure AD is not just your federated authentication mechanism for your applications, but one of that application is also Azure. So Azure AD actually also is sort of an IAM equivalent for AWS, where any permission that, for example, if you want to assign a specific permission to a resource, you would actually use this to do that as well. Now, for example, in this case, there was a VM, and this user, April Irwin, was added as owner for this particular VM. Now, how do you actually add it is something which we will do from the resource. We won't do it from here, but this is just to have a consolidated view of what are Azure role assignments is assigned to a specific users. Now, why is this actually helpful for us? Now, for example, you've got an alert from a defensive perspective that you've compromised this particular user, that this user is actually compromised. Now you would instantly go here and see what is the extent of a blast radius, right? For example, if you've understood that there were two users compromised, now you know which Azure resources are compromised and to what level. If it's an owner, if it's a contributor, or if it's a reader of a blob, or if it's a reader of a keyword, you now know that those resources are assumed to be compromised. Now, on the other hand, you also can ensure that these are remediated before there is suspicious activity on their end. Now, from looking from an attack perspective, now one very interesting thing which I think I should have told you upfront was by default every user who's a part of Azure AD. For example, currently I'm the global administrator for Azure AD, but if I was April Irwin, who is not a global administrator, the entire list of users and the information that I'm seeing is visible to you. Now, this is very, very interesting because this will give you a consolidated view of whom you can target and whom you can take down for reaching your objective, which is, say you want to get to a keyword which has sensitive passwords or sensitive secrets. You know what to do to reach that particular resource. Now, this is all about, a basic understanding of users. Now, groups are nothing but, these are derived from, again, from AD, right? I mean, a lot of Azure AD stuff are derived from a traditional AD. But I would say if you already know these concepts which are related to Active Directory, these are very easy to understand. For example, there is a new group creation where you could create a group and add more people to it. You can add members to it and you can add owners to it. Now, the advantage of group is it's just a logical consolidation of multiple users. For example, you want to add all the HRs to it, want to add all the IT staff to it, and you want to give access to IT staff to a specific maybe resource or to a subscription, etc., etc. So this is where it gets interesting, where if you already know AD, there is a good chance that you already know some concepts which are related to Azure AD. Now, apart from users and groups, we will go about applications in a bit, but I would want to take your attention to something called as monitoring. Now, I was mentioning the consolidated sign-in logs, audit logs, and other analytics are present here right on the bottom section, bottom left corner in Azure AD. Now, if you would want to extract these logs, you could simply download them as CSV or JSON, but there is a better way to do it because in an enterprise you don't want to do it, you don't want to take logs for every 5 minutes, but you would want to actually stream those logs to a destination, which is what we will be looking at in the forthcoming videos. But I just want to assure you that there is a way to do it, and it is in fact possible to do it in the free tier of Azure AD. So whatever I've shown you so far, you could go back and do it in your free Azure account, provided that you just do a free trial. And Azure AD is actually free. The free trial is only to get you an Azure account and just have that experience. But even when your Azure credit expires, if I'm not wrong, you could still use Azure AD for free to some extent, and that basic I would say limit is very, very generous. So look forward to catch you up in the next video. Bye bye.